Hello, my dear masterminds. They assumed you understood their rules because you never challenged them. That's how most systems misread silence. They believe compliance lives in the absence of resistance. They think if someone isn't pushing back, that person must be adapting. So they kept operating the same way. Same expectations, same hierarchies, same unspoken limits. They'd trained everyone else to accept. They spoke to you as if the framework applied. They referenced boundaries as if you recognized them. They acted with the confidence of people who believe the game is shared. What they didn't see was that following rules requires internal agreement. You never gave that. You didn't break their rules loudly. You didn't confront them directly. You simply never internalized the system they were using. You listened without submitting. You moved without aligning. You stayed present without stepping inside their structure. And because you didn't resist, they couldn't tell the difference at first. Resistance confirms the rules exist. You gave them nothing to confirm. You didn't argue their assumptions. You let those assumptions run until they exposed themselves. That's why the realization came slowly, not as a shock, but as a gradual discomfort. Things stopped working the way they expected around you. Their usual influence didn't land. Their incentives didn't pull. Their pressure didn't accelerate anything. You weren't slow. You weren't confused. You were simply not operating from the same reference points. While they were enforcing a structure, you were watching how structures lose influence when someone doesn't recognize their authority. They assumed you were inside the rules because everyone else was. They didn't consider the possibility that you were never there to begin with. Once that discomfort settled in, they started looking for explanations that didn't threaten their framework. They told themselves you were patient, that you were waiting for the right moment, that eventually you'd fall in line the way others always did. Systems depend on that belief. They assume time will do the enforcing if people don't. So they waited, expecting adaptation. What they didn't realize is that time only pressures those who accept the clock they're being measured by. You didn't. You weren't delaying compliance. You weren't preparing a counter move inside their rule set. You were operating without reference to it altogether. That's why time pressure around you felt hollow. That's why expectations lost weight the longer they were repeated. Repetition usually creates authority. Around you, repetition created exposure. Every time they restated a rule, it became clearer. It only existed because others agreed to it. You never did. You acknowledged the structure without granting it legitimacy. That distinction confused them deeply, because most power depends on unexamined consent. You examined it quietly and declined without announcement. They couldn't point to a violation. They couldn't accuse you of rebellion. You weren't breaking anything. You were bypassing it. And bypassing is far more unsettling than resistance. Resistance keeps the system intact by acknowledging it. Bypassing reveals the system as optional. That's when they began to notice how often you moved freely through spaces that constrained everyone else. How outcomes adjusted around you, without escalation. How nothing seemed to bind you the way it bound them. They still didn't name it yet, but the realization was forming. Slowly, inconsistently. And once a realization like that begins, it doesn't stop until it finishes reshaping how everything is interpreted. They started watching you more closely after that, not with suspicion, but with confusion. They expected to see a tell, a sign you were calculating how far you could push before consequences appeared. That moment never came. You didn't test limits, because limits only exist for those who acknowledge them. You didn't probe boundaries because you weren't trying to cross them. You moved as if the boundaries were already irrelevant, and that's what unsettled them. People understand defiance. They understand rebellion. Those are reactions inside the system. You didn't gain freedom by opposing their rules. You gained it by never orienting yourself around them. That's why their authority didn't register with you the way it did with others. You weren't immune. You were uninterested. And uninterested power is the hardest thing to negotiate with. The more they tried to enforce expectations, the clearer it became that enforcement only worked on those who needed permission to begin with. You didn't. You weren't waiting to be allowed. You were already moving. And as they watched this repeat across conversations, across situations, across time, the pattern became undeniable. You weren't selectively following rules. You weren't choosing which ones to obey. You were operating from a different layer entirely. One where rules are observed as behaviors people agree to, not laws of reality. That's when the realization finally locked in. You had never been following their rules. You had been following your own internal logic all along. And once that truth surfaced, there was nothing left for them to enforce. That realization didn't create confrontation. It created recalibration. They stopped issuing expectations the way they used to, not because you pushed back, but because those expectations lost effect the moment they reached you. You didn't absorb them. You didn't reflect them. You didn't reject them either. You let them pass through without attachment. And expectations without attachment lose influence. People rely on reaction to measure authority. When reaction disappears, authority becomes abstract. They felt that gap growing. Conversations became shorter. Instructions became suggestions. Timelines softened around you, not out of generosity, but out of recognition. Recognition that pressure no longer functioned here. You weren't defiant. You weren't compliant. You were unreachable by the mechanism itself. That's when they understood something fundamental. Rules only bind those who organize their identity around approval or consequence. You didn't. You organized yourself around coherence, around internal consistency that didn't need validation from the structure they defended. And when someone operates from coherence, systems don't confront them. Systems adapt around them. That's the quiet ending they didn't expect. No rebellion, no breakdown. Just the slow acceptance that you had never been playing the same game. They thought you were following their rules because that was the only model they understood. It took time for them to see that you weren't above the rules. You were outside them. And once that's seen clearly, it doesn't provoke resistance. It produces silence. And in that silence, the hierarchy subtly shifted. Not on paper, not in titles or declarations, but in behavior. People stopped correcting you. They stopped reminding you how things are supposed to work. They stopped assuming they could steer outcomes by invoking norms you'd never agreed to. The rules didn't disappear. They simply stopped applying in your direction, because rules only function when they're internalized. You never internalized theirs. You acknowledged their existence the way you acknowledge weather, something that happens around you, not something that defines your movement. That's why nothing dramatic had to occur for the transition to settle. No confrontation, no ultimatum, no moment of open defiance. Just a gradual recognition that enforcement without internal agreement has no traction. They realized that every attempt to bring you back inside their structure required something you didn't offer: emotional compliance, fear of consequence, desire for approval. You gave them none of it, and without those inputs, the system had nothing to act on. What unsettled them most wasn't that you broke their rules, it was that you never relied on them. You moved freely because your actions were anchored to your own internal order. And internal order doesn't negotiate with external permission. By the time they fully understood that, the dynamic had already stabilized. You weren't resisting their framework, you had made it optional. And once a framework becomes optional, it no longer holds influence the same way. After that point, nothing they tried carried the same weight. The rules were still spoken, still referenced, still enforced on others. But around you, they lost pull. People adjusted without discussing it. They stopped expecting immediate responses. They stopped framing situations as obligations. They treated your presence as something that required a different approach, even if they couldn't explain why. Not respect in the traditional sense. Recognition, the kind that forms when repeated attempts produce no effect. You didn't earn that recognition by asserting yourself. You earned it by remaining consistent when pressure expected movement. Consistency at that level exposes how conditional most authority really is. They saw that rules only function when someone fears stepping outside them. You didn't. Not because you were reckless, but because your decisions weren't sourced from their incentives. You weren't measuring outcomes by approval or consequence. You were measuring coherence. And coherence doesn't accelerate under pressure. It waits. That waiting unsettled them more than open refusal ever could. Refusal gives something to push against. You gave them nothing. So the system adjusted quietly. Expectations shifted. Timelines softened. Enforcement redirected elsewhere. You became a steady reference point. The structure had to work around instead of through. And once a system adapts that way, it does not return to its old assumptions. You were following something deeper. And once that was recognized, the rules lost influence without anyone needing to break them. That recognition settled in fully, and with it came a quiet boundary. No one tried to test again. Not because you signaled consequences, but because they understood there were none. They could apply, that mattered. You weren't calculating how far you could go inside their limits. You weren't testing tolerance. You were operating from a place that never required permission in the first place. Once that became clear, the dynamic concluded without ceremony. People didn't argue. They didn't escalate. They adjusted. They spoke to you differently. They planned differently around you. They stopped assuming compliance and started accounting for independence. And that shift didn't come from dominance. It came from recognition. They saw that rules only hold influence when someone believes in them enough to obey. You never did. You acknowledged their existence without granting them authority over your choices. That's why nothing dramatic happened at the end. No victory, no fallout, just a silent acceptance that you were never following their rules because you were never operating within their system. You weren't above it. You weren't against it. You were simply elsewhere. And once people understand that someone is operating from elsewhere, they stop trying to direct them carefully, precisely, knowing that whatever governs you isn't something they can touch. That's where it concludes, quietly, enduringly. And what does not revert after that is perception. They don't just remember that you weren't following their rules, they stop assuming rules are universal at all. Something shifts in how they interpret authority, compliance, and control. They begin to see how much of what is obeyed is sustained by repetition, belief, and shared agreement, rather than necessity. You didn't lecture them into that awareness. You didn't force it into view. You let them arrive there on their own by never stepping into the frame they were operating inside. That's why it stays. Realizations reached without resistance don't provoke defensiveness. They install themselves quietly from that point forward. People hesitate before invoking rules as leverage. They pause before assuming alignment. They sense, even if they can't articulate it, that some individuals are guided by internal order rather than external permission. And those individuals don't need to be managed. They need to be accounted for. You didn't change the rules. You revealed their limits by not recognizing them as binding. And once that boundary is seen clearly, it doesn't unravel into confusion. It resolves into clarity. That's the settled state, not rebellion, not dominance, but a recalibration of what actually holds influence. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they realized next is that some people never do. What settles last is not admiration or resistance, but orientation. They stop trying to categorize you within their framework, because frameworks only work on what they can contain. You were never containable by their rules, and now they understand why. You weren't exploiting loopholes. You weren't manipulating the system. You weren't selectively obedient. You were anchored to an internal order that didn't negotiate with external permission. That's why nothing about you ever felt reactive. That's why pressure passed you without effect. They finally understood that rules function by shaping behavior through incentive, fear, or belonging. You didn't rely on any of those inputs, so the rules had nothing to attach to. Once that becomes clear, enforcement loses relevance, not loudly, quietly, consistently. People adjust expectations without discussion. They stop assuming timelines apply. They stop expecting compliance as default. They move with more care, knowing there are individuals who operate from coherence rather than constraint. You didn't break their rules. You exposed their dependence on belief. And once belief fades, authority becomes suggestion. That's where it ends. Not with rebellion, not with control, with clarity that holds. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. And in realizing that, they learned something deeper. Some people aren't governed by systems. Systems adapt around them. And this is where it finally settles as something stable. They no longer try to pull you into alignment. They stop testing boundaries. They stop waiting for you to adjust. That expectation fades because they understand now that compliance was never delayed. It was never pending. It was never part of the equation. You weren't learning their system or adapting to it. You were moving according to an internal order that did not require their permission to function. That realization does not spark conflict. It ends it. People stop investing energy where influence does not attach. They stop enforcing what does not register. They stop mistaking structure for authority. And once that happens, the relationship between you and the system stabilizes in a new way. You are no longer treated as someone who needs guidance or correction. You are treated as someone who must be considered carefully, quietly, Precisely, without assumption. You did not dismantle their rules. You made them optional by never recognizing them as binding in the first place. And when something becomes optional, it stops functioning as influence. This is not dominance that needs display, not rebellion that needs noise, but independence so complete it reshapes behavior around it. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to. What remains after this is not tension or unfinished business. It is a quiet correction in how they read reality. They no longer assume compliance when someone is calm. They no longer mistake patience for acceptance. They hesitate before invoking rules, as if those rules are universal truths, because they remember how effortlessly their framework lost relevance around you. You did not oppose it. You did not submit to it. You remained outside it, long enough for its limits to become clear. That experience installs itself. They carry it forward into other rooms, other negotiations, other moments where silence appears. And this time, they pause. They check. They do not rush to assume alignment. You did not leave them with a story about you. You left them with a boundary on their assumptions. A lasting reminder that some people are guided by internal order, not external permission. And when that is the case, rules do not fall into chaos. They resolve into clarity, not a confrontation, not a victory, a recalibration so clean it never needs to be revisited. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is why that realization mattered. And this is where it concludes in the only way it ever could. Not with resistance, not with control, but with recognition that does not need reinforcement. They stop framing you as an exception. They stop trying to interpret you through their lens. They accept, quietly, that you were never meant to fit inside their rules because your movement was never sourced from them. You did not leave their system. You were never formed by it. That understanding settles and stays settled. People do not argue with it because there is nothing to argue against. Your consistency made the reality clear. Your calm made it stable. You did not need to prove independence. You demonstrated it by never asking permission. And once that is seen clearly, behavior adjusts on its own. Expectations fall away. Enforcement redirects. Assumptions dissolve. The system continues functioning, just not in your direction. You remain exactly where you always were, operating from an internal order that does not negotiate with external authority. They slowly realized you were never following their rules. What they understand now is that you never needed to, and that understanding stays with them. It does not require repetition. It does not require explanation. It does not invite debate. It simply remains, quiet, stable, and complete.